People consume too much salt. WHO warns millions could die if action is not taken. A WHO report says limiting the amount of sodium in food could help save up to 7 million lives by 2030. By the end of the decade, 7 million people could die from salt-related illnesses if governments don't take urgent action to curb salt. This was warned by the World Health Organization in its report on Thursday. Its sponsors are calling on countries to introduce stricter regulations on the addition of sodium to foods, more clearly indicate its content on packaging, and raise public awareness of the health risks posed by eating large amounts of salty foods. Excessive sodium intake is a major risk factor for unhealthy diets and is responsible for 1.8 million deaths each year, said Francesco Branca, head of the WHO's Department of Nutrition, Health and Development. According to the World Health Organization, too much salt is one of the causes of cardiovascular disease, which kills about 17.9 million people every year. It can also lead to strokes and other serious illnesses that claim the lives of 5 million people worldwide every year. Branca noted that governments could save a lot of people by imposing mandatory limits on the amount of salt the food industry is allowed to add to processed foods. He also added that the bulk of the sodium that most Americans consume comes from these foods, and not from the salt they sprinkle on their food at home in the kitchen. It's really something that won't cost anything, Branca said. It's a simple intervention, but incredibly effective. Most people in the world consume about 10.8 grams of salt per day, which is more than double the level recommended by both the WHO and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which recommend no more than a teaspoon of salt per day. Although it is an essential nutrient, sodium, which is 40% salt, constricts and thickens blood vessels. If more salt is retained in the body, it gradually raises blood pressure, says Graham McGregor, professor of cardiovascular medicine at Queen Mary University of London, who was not involved in the preparation of the report but advocates lower sodium intake. High blood pressure leads to strokes, heart attacks or heart failure, he said. Many other health organizations, including the American Heart Association, the American College of Cardiology, and the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, also advise people to drastically reduce their sodium intake. This position is based on decades of scientific evidence, including an analysis of hundreds of published studies highlighting the health risks of sodium, and remains unchanged despite a number of studies in recent years that have called it into question. The WHO said on Thursday that it hopes to reduce global salt consumption by 30% from 2013 levels, a 12-year goal agreed upon by all of the organization's 194 member countries at the time, but none have reached it. Branca said he is considering extending it until 2030. In a review of world governments' policies to reduce salt in food, WHO found that only 9 of its members have taken sufficiently comprehensive measures to reduce excessive salt intake, 5% of the total number of countries. The UN Health Organization is calling on governments to raise public awareness of the dangers of overly salty foods and to be more explicit about the salt content on packages. WHO officials believe that in order to wean the world from a deadly habit, it is necessary to introduce mandatory salt levels, given that much of it is used by food manufacturers and not added by individual consumers. It makes no sense to tell people to stop adding salt to their food, McGregor said. It's already in the products. According to the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, more than 70% of the salt in American diets comes from packaged and prepared foods, not homemade salt shakers. In September, the FDA announced that it plans to change the way food is labeled on packages to indicate that it is healthy. In addition to other nutrients, manufacturers will have to adhere to certain limits on sodium content. In response, the Consumer Brands Association, which represents 1,700 major companies including General Mills and Pepsi, said the proposed legislation was overly restrictive and proposed revising nutrient thresholds and slightly increasing sugar and sodium limits. Branca said part of the reason food manufacturers continue to add so much salt, despite known health risks, is that people have abused it over the years, causing their taste buds to become immune to excessive amounts of sodium. You expect a certain amount of salt and think that if there is none, then the food is tasteless, he says. Manufacturers don't want to take the lead in reducing sodium if there is a competitor with a higher salt content, he said, demanding that governments force manufacturers to reduce these levels through mandatory salt addition quotas. The benefits of reducing sodium intake appear relatively quickly, the scientists say. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, for most people, blood pressure begins to drop within a few weeks, and salt sensitivity soon returns. Your taste buds will adjust to the reduced amount of salt, and you'll be able to taste other flavors better, Branca says. In his opinion, your food can become even tastier.